Throughout its history, Russia has captured foreign lands, colonizing indigenous peoples, destroying their national identity, then using the same peoples to seize new territories and enslave other nations. As we see today in the 21st century, the methods that the Kremlin used 500 years ago just do not change. And it does not matter what the name of the state is, the Muscovy, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation, the essence remains the same. Today, just like the other enslaved peoples in the past, the Komi gave their lives for the imperial ambitions of the Kremlin, apparently completely forgetting how almost 100 years ago the Muscovites killed their ancestors in the same way and took their territories. And after that, the survivors were forced to forget the atrocities of the Kremlin, their history were rewritten, cultural heritage destroyed, their very lives repressed.
At the very beginning of the full-scale invasion,
everyone was shocked.
My colleagues and I went to the main square of Syktyvkar. They started to detain people rather harshly, all those who were publicly speaking out against the war. Young people, part of them were looking for ways not to go to the military enlistment office.
Especially people were taken from the villages, where in many regions the majority of the population are still the Komi.
Of course, the indigenous peoples are sent there.
So they just wipe out the leftovers of the Komi people.
I advocate decolonization and the people's right to decide for themselves whether to live under some jurisdiction or not. All peoples have the right of self-determination.
Komi Republic will be free.
On February 24, 2022, Vladimir Putin announced the beginning of the so-called special military operation. Despite the total propaganda trying to convince people that the war was supported by every single soul, people in the Komi Republic turned out to be against the war.
Of course, the first reaction was shock. This could not be true. Why one has to go to war in the 21st century to kill people and die themselves?
As soon as the full-scale invasion began, of course, there were strikes. People came out, and we got the feeling that it was possible to come out and protest somehow. My colleagues and I went to the main square of Syktyvkar. Some people were already there, and at 18:53 I was already detained. For going up to the police officers and asking them why they weren't ashamed of their state, starting a war in the 21st century. People are immediately threatened with articles. The police immediately disperse all protesters. I would not conclude from this that anti-war sentiments have fully disappeared. It likely continues somewhere in some other forms of protest, because people have many reasons to be dissatisfied with the policies of the Putin regime itself.
There are people who believe propaganda. Of course, there are some of those, but according to my feelings and my context, they are just a minority.
After the announcement made by the President of the Russian Federation on the mobilization throughout the country, including the Komi Republic, people have been massively taken away to the military registration and enlistment offices in order to be sent to the criminal war in Ukraine. They were taken away from their homes, educational institutions, and even right off the streets.
We see from social media, from communication with friends. At first there was panic that everyone might be taken away. Some tried to leave, tried to hide in other flats, just not to go.
For many, especially those relatives and friends who have children and husbands of conscription age, mobilization age, for them it suddenly became very close. It stopped being somewhere on TV only. Many got bored and began to plan ways of escape, protection, how to secure themselves and their loved ones.
Young people have always been more protesting, more anti-war, and so they were looking for ways not to go to the military enlistment office.
When they began to take them away, especially people were taken out from the villages, where in many regions, the majority of the population are still the indigenous Komi people, so they just wipe out the leftovers of the Komi people.
Posts that someone died somewhere at the front appear in social media every day. Of course, the indigenous peoples are sent there, but it seems to me that in the Kremlin they couldn't care less who dies in the war eventually.
According to the data provided by the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, the Russian army has already lost more than 220,000 soldiers and officers, most of whom are representatives of colonized indigenous peoples from national republics that are currently part of the Russian Federation.
I see all these posts on social media when they bully Asians, for example, or send them first in those assault brigades because they are second class for them. And the racism, this national discrimination has always been there. Just no one talked about it.
One thing is complicated about the Komi Republic, possibly because of the Christianization. But our names and surnames are about the same to other Russians. So not every Komi has a surname that is distinct from the Russian, and it is very difficult to identify us that way. But it is quite possible that there are actually even more Komi than Russians in percentage ratio. I've been following a Telegram channel called Me Komi for some time, and at some point there were regular posts about a citizen from the Komi Republic who died in the war. There was a wave of deaths of people who were sent from the region to war, both Russians and Komi. At some point these messages just stopped. It seems to me that the person who runs this Telegram channel just got warned that he shouldn't rock the boat, so to say.
We are all Russians only when we have to die for Moscow, but when we want to rent a flat in Moscow, it turns out that we are not Russians.
More than 190 nationalities live in the territory of the Russian Federation. Most of them are indigenous peoples enslaved and colonized by Moscow in different periods of their history. So, how did the Komi turn out to be a part of Russia after all?
Now, when I read the history of other nationalities, I read the history of the Komi from other sources and I see how bloody it was. Of course, no one joined voluntarily.
As for the Christianization, it turns out that, first of all, it was not very peaceful, and all this was started with an armed detachment.
One of the most important tools of Muscovy's expansion was the church. In the vanguard of Moscow colonialism were the priests, followed by the Muscovite troops armed to the teeth. Conquest of Komi is a vivid example of the cooperation between the church and the imperial power of Muscovy in order to capture and enslave these people.
Stefan Hrab, the monk who was later called Stephen of Perm, was sent by Moscow authorities, both secular and spiritual, to preach Christianity. The whole process of Christianization took more than 1 century. In Moscow literature it is described as Stephen of Perm coming to baptize the Komi, but in reality, along with this Christianization was a process of colonization.
The fate of the Komi people was decided by the events of 1472, when the Muscovite detachment seized Cherdyn and Iskol. The settlements had no military fortifications and were the peaceful objects. Their main purpose of the military special operation of the Muscovites was to destroy the traditional religion of the Komi Permians, which made the further enslavement a purely technical issue.
In Komi it was bloody. It lasted quite a long time, more than a century, gradually. Many people were either forcibly baptized, died as a result of it, or were forced to flee. Of course, there were those who embraced this religion, but it's impossible to name it bloodless.
The Komi lands attracted the greedy Muscovites as a source of valuable furs or fur products. The entire economy of the Moscow Principality was based on yasak, taking with fur products, just as the economy of the modern Russian Empire was built on the oil and gas trade.
In 1481, the first census was taken here, a census, so to speak, of taxpayers.
Komi is a territory with rivers everywhere and valuable furs. If you come to Croatia, for example, you will see that they have a coin with a motif. It is called kuna. Where does this kuna come from? In fact, it comes from Komi.
In 1708, as a result of the provincial reform of the Peter the Great, the Komi land was divided in two provinces, resulting in the Komi ceased to exist as a single people in the administration.
What is also important here is that there are Komi Permians and Komi-Syrians. Nowadays, Komi Republic is inhabited by Komi-Syrians. It happened that basically there is one nation, but the Komi Permians had contacted with the Russians earlier than the Komi-Syrians. Just in a couple of centuries, the Komi Permians were pushed away from the places where they originally lived.
Protests occurred there. It was recorded in the 19th century when the Tsar Emperor ordered to build a new road. Komi, Zyryansk region, was a part of Vologda province back then, and they refused because they did not understand what they had to do with some other region and Arkhangelsk residents or someone else, why they had to build a road, and they were told that your state serves. They answered, well, come try to capture us, and eventually a military skirmish took place there.
Talks that the Komi should have its state began actively appearing somewhere in the 19th century, but eventually something became possible to do only with the collapse of the Russian Empire.
In the early 20th century, the Komi people made attempts to gain their own statehood, but as a result of the collapse of the Russian Empire and the Bolshevik seizure of power, the Komi were drawn into a civil war.
The Komi, besides the red and white armies, also had the green. The Greens fought against both armies. They did not like the Bolsheviks, who had seized power and started the war. But they did not like the whites either. These people just wanted to live in their own territory. Ust-Sysalsk reacted extremely negatively to the Bolshevik coup. But today you cannot find testimonies except for the message that Ust-Sysalsk was against this government.
20 числом ноября 9/10 территории Коми-края было занято белыми. Но такое положение продолжалось буквально считанные дни. Уже 29 ноября контрударом советских войск и местных партизанских отрядов белые выбиты из Яринска и начали беспорядочный отход на север.
The Russification became even more rampant because before the revolution, more than 90% of Syktyvkar residents spoke Komi. But with the advent of the Soviet Union, the situation changed radically.
During the Soviet period, when autonomy was being formed, there was a plan to unite the Komi Permians and Komi-Syrians, but apparently the Soviet authorities did not want the autonomous Komi to be located on such a vast territory.
A telegram was sent to Moscow aimed at the quick revival of the Komi people and taking into account peculiarities of their national development to proclaim the Zyryan region as a federal republic. But Moscow decided differently, and on August the 22nd, 1921, the Komi autonomous region was proclaimed.
Closer to the 1930s, Stalin came to power and began gradually winding down all of national projects throughout the Soviet Union.
When Stalin came to power, everything was eradicated very quickly. All the people were shot and imprisoned, and everything ended. Their ideas were very similar to the ideas that are being raised now: decolonization, restoration of culture, and the Komi language. In the 1930s, a completely different story began here, a very scary one. This is the history of the Gulag. This is the history resulting in many more towns appearing in Komi. As a result of it, Komi became a very multinational region. We had 18 camps from 1929 to 1956. One of the first camps was the Nizhnechovsky agricultural camp. It was created back in 1925. The representatives of various parties opposed to the Bolsheviks were exiled there.
Starting from about the middle of 20th century, no one was particularly interested in the Komi. Then they began to find minerals, and when Stalin's industrialization began, it was done with the help of prison labor.
The next camp to be established was the famous Uhtpech camp, which by 1933 had expanded to the territories of 7 Frances.
The main mistake in building the autonomy was that they decided to build a good region with other people's hands and created the Gulag system of camps. It seems that this ruined the republic because before the gulags, as I said, the population was 95% of Komi and a few percent of the others, so it was a mono-ethnic region. Then, because of the gulags, as they exiled people to us, population of Komi here is 20% now.
In the times of perestroika and the collapse of the Soviet Union, Komi again got to revive its statehood. On August 29, 1990, the Declaration of the State Sovereignty of the Komi ASSR was adopted.
In the 1990s, we adopted a constitution declaring Komi a sovereign republic. We had our own constitution, our own president, and it declared that the power in Komi belongs to the Komi people.
Люди хотят знать точно ваше мнение. С кем вы, Юрий Алексеевич?
С кем я? Я с республикой. И республика будет жить по своим законам. Хватит нам уже кому-то служить. Я вам говорю конкретно. Коми СССР будет жить по своим законам и будем нарабатывать свою государственность и суверенитет.
Immediately, contacts began to be established with the entire Finno-Ugric world, with Hungary, Finland. Everyone wanted independence, wanted some independent cultural and economic context without the mediation of Moscow.
Финно-угорские народы имеют богатую и древнюю историю. Это история единой общности народов, некогда составлявших одну цивилизацию. Мы задали тему нашего конгресса «Финно-угорский мир. Реальность и перспективы».
Politically, it seemed that somehow things were beginning to recover from the Soviet Union. The sovereignty was declared and it could in theory turn into a referendum, and the Komi Republic would want to become an independent separate state. But it all started with an example of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria.
Putin comes to power, we have the constitution changed again. Sovereign is removed from there, the Komi language is removed from there, the Komi is removed from there, and we simply become a subject of the federation even without a president, but with a head.
The first article was that the source of power in the Republic was the Komi people, and this was replaced with something neutral, that the multinational people of the Republic were the source of power there. They also immediately banned local parties all over Russia.
There was a very big conflict a few years ago, a lot of pickets about the Komi language, because it is already transferred into the sphere of optional language learning, and we understand that this, in general, should not be done if you want to preserve the language, because we already have the example of Karelia, which has lost the language.
The compulsory study of the Komi language was called off, like in other regions of Russia. Now this language is not normally learned in schools.
There is a precedent of use of the Komi language during a strike, when the cops detain you. According to Constitution, you have a full right to speak in Komi, and the police have to answer you in this language. But in reality, they don't understand anything and can't do anything. There is an activist, Alexei Ivanov, who spoke in Komi in court, a great young man.
У нас ведется производство на русском языке. Вы живете в России. Учились в русской школе. Коми нула. Каналан кыскык. Рочь да коми. Замечательно. Да. Замечательно. Хорошо, обеспечивайте проявку переводчика.
My experience with the police shows that there is a law under which they are obliged to communicate in the state language. The Komi language is considered the state language alongside Russian, but this law is not enforced at all. If the police, the authorities, come to me with any claim saying that here we have a law, then I also have a request to comply with all the laws that exist.
Despite the total control of the security services and repressions, protest sentiments in the Komi Republic have always been strong. Suffice it to recall thousands of people protesting against the construction of a landfill near the Shias station.
At some point, Moscow decided to build on the border of Arkhangelsk region and the Komi shares, a landfill where they planned to haul garbage from Moscow and store it for us to know our place, that we are dumpster.
People were outraged by this, and for a whole year they were coming out all over the Republic, and there was the largest rally eventually.
Зачем нам московский мусор? У нас своего хватает. Да, нам своего хватает. Не знаем, куда девать.
Перерабатывать, мы свой будем перерабатывать. Все вообще решили сделать самую большую помойку. Как будто мы здесь не люди, какое-то быдло.
Это скорее сыграло на политизацию.
This rather played on the politicization of the population, because these protests were joined by thousands of people who had never been involved in politics before. Suddenly they became participants in rallies that ended up being anti-Putin rallies, because they ended up with resolutions in favor of Putin's resignation.
Владимир Путин, высший главнокомандующий, объявил Республике Коми войну. Именно он является самым большим сторонником строительства мусорного полигона на Шиисе. Именно им это инициировано, и мы должны потребовать в первую очередь именно его отставки. Без этого ничего не изменится.
Мусороперерабатывающие заводы многие строить не хотят. Или рядом с собой видеть не хотят. Мусоросжигательные заводы не хотят. Свалки не хотят. А чего мы хотим?
ШИС и протест вокруг него.
Shares and the protest around it, its defense, seemed to awaken some national or at least a local consciousness for the Komi and for the Arkhangelsk citizens, because we realized they do not care about us at all.
In the end, this landfill was not built, but from time to time there are conversations that we need to build an incinerator here and something else, and this once again rises up a new wave of indignation.
We have a fairly rich land of minerals, which of course are often extracted with barbaric methods.
There is gas production, oil production, coal mining, titanium production, gold production, and much more. And it would seem that just because the Komi Republic produces a lot of things, it should live very well, which is in reality not quite what we have.
For example, one of the first decrees passed by a current barbarian from Moscow, their protege Uyba, was to permit gold mining in a national park, which is in the UNESCO heritage list.
All these wealth, of course, goes to Moscow. For example, oil company Lukoil, all their profits don't remain in the region. What remains are serious environmental problems, constant oil spills, but all the money is accumulated in Moscow.
To put it bluntly, how is this notorious vertical of power built? We take away everything from the regions and then we give little bits and pieces of it to them, and they cannot ask for more. This has had numerous, very grave consequences.
The Komi Republic is still considered a republic, but in fact it has no rights as a federal entity. If in the 90s there were some prospects that you could fight for your rights in the legal field, then with the arrival of Putin everything was boxed in, and it is not possible to do anything at all now. Everything is stewing in its own juice. The independence of the Komi Republic from Moscow was always perceived as something very marginal. People would rather perceive you as a fool or an urban madman for this idea, but now it no longer looks that way.
Without the decolonization of mindset, without the decolonization of Russia, it cannot go any longer. It's impossible in the 21st century. Without this, there will be constant aggression and imperialism, the seizure of new territories and repressions inside.
The full-scale invasion of sovereign Ukraine by the Russian Federation on February 24, 2022 made the whole world shudder. Many countries began to rethink their security strategies, joining military alliances, revising their defense budgets, and also certain processes began to occur in the Russian Federation itself. Many opposition politicians, public figures, activists, and representatives of various nationalities began to think about the security and the future of their own peoples, and organizations such as the League of Free Nations and the Foreign Forum of Free Post-Russian Nations aimed at the decolonization of Russia appeared.
As of today, there is no one from Komi, and if anyone is watching and wants to join, welcome. I invite you. We are always happy to welcome you. There must be a decolonization movement. I am for decolonization because people have the right to decide for themselves whether to live under a certain jurisdiction or not. All peoples have the right of self-determination. It is an obvious fact. I support the decolonization movement and I see nothing wrong in it.
This will be decided by the residents of Komi on the basis of what is best for us, what is best for our land, how we can live in this region comfortably, conveniently, pleasantly, and maintain a quite aggrieved land from which they only take and take, pump and pump.
In terms of historical heritage, they naturally have a great right to their independence. And even more in terms of economic component, they have even more right for their statehood and independence, because it is one of the few regions which is actually a donor of the federal budget. The full-scale invasion has made the issues even more relevant, because people don't want to associate themselves with the Russian world. People don't want to associate themselves with the war crimes that Russia commits.
All this war is against the Ukrainian identity, and we were told the same. In our ethnic regions, they tell us the same thing, that all of us are Russian. The example of Ukrainians inspires us very much to fight for our identity, for the right to be ourselves, to speak the Komi language, to have our own culture, different from the Russian one.
We could make some kind of union like the European Union, and there will remain these connections of the regions with each other. I would advise them to consider the possibility of cooperation with neighboring regions, the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Okrug and the Arkhangelsk region. In cooperation with these regions, their chances of future independence become more than high.
In February 2023, representatives of the indigenous colonized nations of the Russian Federation organized and conducted online referendums on the independence of 5 regions of Russia.
About the republics: Ingria, which is St. Petersburg, Keninsberg, Ural, Kuban, Siberia. In February, all these regions voted for their independence with varying percentages on the referendums.
At the moment, these regions are voting for leaders who would be able to lead the new states during the transition period.
Now these primaries are taking place and people are voting and determine who, from their point of view, should be the transitional leader. Most likely there will be a period of transition, and it is necessary to understand leaders, so that we don't have a fratricidal war or a regional war. And so this process goes by the example of 1991 in the USSR, but not by the example of Yugoslavia. Some leaders are needed at least for a certain period of time.
The ideas of decolonization and self-determination of the nations inhabiting modern Russia are becoming increasingly popular. The initiative to hold online referendums for independence was put forward by representatives of 5 more colonized regions of Russia.
Since July the 1st, 5 new regions have been launched in the referendum. These are 2 national republics and 3 ordinary regions. The National Republic of Karelia and Chuvashia, with very active guys who promote this. Also the Voronezh and Novgorod regions, and the most promising in terms of gaining independence in the near future is Belgorod, the Belgorod People's Republic.
Voting will take place from July 1st to 15th. Residents of regions where online referendums will be held can vote at Referendum 2023 site.
We need to, on the one hand, go back and on the other hand, move forward, to acknowledge the mistakes of the past, to work on them, to sort them out, to pay for them. It will be very long, hard, but without this, we cannot move forward.
I recommend that all residents, Russians and especially residents of the Republic, look at what happened in Nazi Germany after the denazification, what they told, how they were ashamed of everything, and I'm sure that all this awaits Russians in the future as well, so it is better to prepare for this in advance, and it will be extremely shameful, but we all have to go through it.
Mi Komi, mi Ninem Osko, sen Ukraine, by Lvoli per Gorte, sen Vichishin. Moskva is Nekorna, as Ninem Burse, mi and Levich, by Lokti, Kor Ти Комина, Комина, Сен и Кольчи. Я очень надеюсь, что Коми будет свободным.